Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about trimming this plate here. This is nice in the leather hard category, leather hard stage, similar to how our tiles were when we built those cubes. And that's really important when we're trimming and trimming plates especially. If this is too soft, this is going to cave in as we're applying pressure to it. So it's really important that we're at that point where the clay isn't sticky, clay isn't flopping around, and then I can push on it and I'm not going to make any changes. You can even hear that kind of a thuddy sound. So let's go ahead and get started working on this. So I'm going to just grab a slightly damp sponge, turn my wheel on, and just clean all of this off. So I have a nice clean work surface, like so. And then, obviously we're going to trim this top side down. So I'm going to place this onto the wheel head. And this has still got a little bit of moisture on it. I don't want it wet, but it's just, I had a real wrung out sponge. So I want to make sure this isn't too wet on the wheel head. It's just important that it's clean, and this one wasn't. So similar to how when we put these on started dealing with the clay initially, we want to make sure that our plates are centered before we start trimming. So if you can see that on the side cam or the aerial cam, this is clearly not centered. If you see that motion happening, that's going to make it really challenging to try and trim this. So we want to make sure that it's centered. And so again, we can use these concentric circles to kind of move our plates into a more centered position. So if I think about this outside circle, I'm trying to get about an even distance in between here and there. And so we've still got a little bit of movement to it. And so I can kind of hold my finger to the side here. And if I notice as it's going around, some spots are hitting my finger and some parts are missing. And so right now it's missing. So I'm just going to tap into that direction a little bit. And there, so that's much more centered. So when we try to center these, we want to think about what we're centering off of. In an idealized world, our rim and our foot are at exact same kind of radius of centered. That's not always the case. So we don't want to necessarily trim off of the rim because that could put our foot off to the side. And then the way that this was cut off as well, you can see there's some unevenness to it, so that can make that hard to base off of this edge. So I'm just below that surface that's been cut off. So that's about ready. So the next thing I want to do, I want to make sure that as I'm trimming this doesn't fly off of the surface because, well, that'd be a bummer. So I'm going to take some fresh clay, nice and soft, and then just press this down onto the wheel head and just let that clay kind of push onto the plate to kind of hold that in place. I want to make sure as I do this that I'm not pushing too much of the clay directly onto the plate because that could make it want to stick sometimes and give it some problems. There we go. Okay, so for our trimming tools that we're going to use, we have the big loop tool, and this is going to be helpful for removing large quantities of clay at once. And then we have the smaller one that has a straight edge and a rounded edge. That's going to be more helpful in kind of detailing aspects of this, removing smaller amounts of clay from smaller spaces. So it's going to be kind of a combination of both of these. And then I also like to have a bottle cap handy. This probably came from like a milk jug or Gatorade container or something, to use as like to help me hold the plate in place. So I'm going to start with the bigger one that I have. And actually, let me take this off real quick. I didn't talk about this. So I need to gauge where the outside of my foot ring is going to be because I want to trim that before I trim the inside. And so as I think about this, if I look at this profile, looking at the profile of this plate, this is way too wide of a foot. It just isn't going to be really bulky, really heavy. But if I go too narrow with my foot ring, like say if I put a foot ring in here, that would just be way too much space for this clay to kind of cantilever out into space, and it would most likely crack or flop or flatten out in the kiln. So we have to kind of figure out a space that's good kind of in between that. So what I like to look for is, there's kind of this main part of this plate, that's kind of got this nice kind of somewhat even flatness to it, or very shallow curve to it. And then right about here is where it really starts to lift up into that edge. And so I'm going to think about this spot right here as where I want my foot ring to end. And so if I hold this up, and then I can kind of gauge where my finger and thumb are meeting. It's about right there. So I'm just going to make a little mark with my nail. So I'm going to place that down. I'm going to recenter this real quick. Okay. Reattach, reattach, and reattach. So like I said, so I've got a marker right there for what I want to be my outside. And I'm going to start using this big tool to just try and remove as much clay as I can. Because like I had mentioned in class that we need to make these thicker so that we can actually create a nice foot on this. And so we'll see what that looks like as this goes. And again, I'm just going to, I can either hold my hand here on top or I can hold this cap. I prefer the cap, but you're welcome to try it either way. And so when I use this tool, I want to be careful that I hold it really secure in my hand. We want to think about if I hold it like this, it's just going to kind of bounce around a lot. Because the clay is so firm right now, we want to make sure that we're kind of, really kind of holding the tool tight, holding the tool secure. So I'm going to hold it really tight up into my hand like this, so that the handle's really in my hand in control, and then my hand or my finger and my thumb are really trying to control that top piece so it doesn't want to move around. And then I also have, I'm supporting myself on the splash pan. I've got the arm connected to the body to keep it rigid. And then I'm also going to balance my left hand that's holding onto the plate, is also trying to help secure the right hand in place. So if your plate's at a good consistency, you're just going to start having these nice ribbons of clay come off. If your clay's too wet, it's going to just gunk up your tool. So you want to be careful not to have too wet of clay. And if you have too dry of clay, it's going to sound like nails on a chalkboard, or just kind of this really bad screeching sound. And if your clay's gotten into that bone dry category, you might as well just toss that bowl in the reclaim and just start over. It's not going to trim well, and it's going to end up cracking. It's going to probably end up breaking in the process. It's much better for your time, your health, because it's going to create a lot of dust, and for your overall grade on the project, to just start and make a new one rather than try and trim the bowl past its time. So I'm going to take a little bit more off here. And I can start turning this tool inward to create more of that kind of straight foot line that I want, or outside of the foot. So let's see where we're at. Okay, so we're going to take this in just a little bit more. So now we have kind of the outside of the foot defined here on the side. But I've got a lot of extra clay here that I'm going to use this smaller tool to get rid of. And so I'll show you after I've got this being finished, but the idea is that we want to think about this as the inside and the outside having the same exact shape. So if there's lines or contour on the inside, or shape changes, we want to match that. So I've got that curve happening on this area of the plate, so I want to make sure that that curve on the inside is also on the outside. So right now the outside's mostly finished. I'll do some more detailing as I go, but I want to start focusing on the inside. And so I want to start thinking about the thickness of what my foot's going to be. My foot thickness should be about the same as the thickness of my rim. I don't want it to be too thin because it could crack, it could break, it could chip, all those sorts of things. So I'm going to start this making it a little bit larger than I need to. So right now this would be my foot, a little bigger than it needs to be, but I always like to err on the side of caution as I start this. And then as I go, I'll start defining it much more appropriately. Same idea for trying to trim this clay out of the inside. Trying to hold the tool nice and secure. Don't want it to bounce around. So again, I want to think about, you know, the shape of the outside to the inside, having kind of like, you know, if this foot wasn't here, there would just be like a continuous curve that matches the inside. So as I'm removing clay from the inside, I want to think about a couple things. Again, getting that thickness of the foot ring right, but I also want to make sure that I've trimmed away enough so that it's an even thickness, but I also want to make sure that I've left enough clay, or I've started with enough clay when I was talking about thickness of a plate being important. I want to make sure that my foot can be tall enough that I glaze the inside of this. And so I can just use a ruler or a flat edge. See that? Hopefully you can see that space in there. But there is a space that's happening in between this foot and the bottom of that. And so that means I'll be able to glaze that, and that's a good thing. So now I want to go ahead and start kind of redefining this foot a little bit. Like I said, it's on the thicker side, but that's really easy to fix. So as I want to think about this, the height of it's pretty good, so I don't want to take too much off the top. I'm mostly going to be focusing on the sides to get that plate or that thickness closer to the rim. And I'm just going to start using this outside or the inside with my little tool. So as I think about my foot shape, you know, we can, you know, basically go straight up and down with it, flared in or flared out. I like to have them flared out. If we flare straight up and down or flare inward, it's going to be really hard to kind of grab onto the foot as you're using the plate or cleaning the plate or anything like that. So by flaring it out just a little bit, I'm going to be able to have just a nice little groove under there, and that's going to be able to also help catch a lot of glaze in case it runs, and it's just going to create a nicer look to the shape. So I'm just going to angle my tool inward, like so. Get rid of what came up. And then again, I want to think about this thickness. This thickness right now, feeling it in my fingers, matches up with that rim pretty well. So that thickness I think is pretty good. And you also notice I have it flared out on the outside, so I have it flared out on the inside, so that it becomes a nice, again, even clay. So the next thing I want to think about is this flat foot is just a little bit too much. It's just too flat. It's not going to look very appealing or anything like that, especially with this nice round rim. Why don't we put a little bit more detail or thought into the flatness of this foot? So rather than leaving it like this, essentially I'm going to try and basically shave off about 45 degrees off of the top edge of both sides, the inside and the outside, and meet that in the middle, like so. It's not a whole lot, and like so. So now that I have that, I'm just going to drop a very small flat line right across the bottom of this, like so. And so what that does is it just gives us a much smaller contact point, which is going to be good for how the plate's used, how it's fired, things like that. And then also on the outside, that bevel's going to give us a nice little bit of shadow. So the last thing I want to do is I'm going to take just a really wrung out damp sponge and just lightly moisten the surface. And if you can see it, I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but you'll see it in person. This has left all sorts of what we call trim scars. And I just want to take a rib to smooth those out, but I also want to focus on compressing this. Like I mentioned while we were throwing plates, the compression is really important so that it doesn't want to crack. I'm just going to hit all of those areas really quick. And there we go. So we have a trimmed plate. And those lugs should just come right off. If sometimes a little bit of residue is left, and I can just take that off with my finger. And so at this point, I just want to be careful. This has really been freshly trimmed, and I just added some moisture to it, so I don't want to find something to put this on and just drop it onto that foot like that. One, it could damage the foot. And two, I like to dry plates upside down. A lot of times if you dry them right side up, the rim will dry out too fast, and then you'll end up getting a crack around the rim. So I think it's better to slow dry them upside down, and obviously with your name across the bottom. But let's look at this one real quick. So I'm just going to, we don't have to do these with the ears. I'm just want to let this be an example of what it looks like on the interior. So see this nice evenness that's been trimmed. We have this nice space created by our foot ring. And so this is ideally, what the insides looks like once we're finished. Nice and even, nice even thickness, even lines, nice even round foot ring. That's a trimmed plate.